My worker complained about the lazy owner of the 45 minutes, not knowing I was the owner I talked about. I walked into the big room at my manufacturing plant, wearing jeans and an old colleague hoodie, carrying my lunch in paper bag like I always did. The place was buzzing with the usual midday crowd, workers grabbing quick meals before heading back to their station. I had owned this company for 15 years after buying it from my mentor, who taught me everything about the business, and I made it a point to dress like everyone else when I visited the floor. No fancy suits or executive badges. Just comfortable clothes that let me blend in, see how things really ran when nobody knew the boss was watching. I spot an empty seat at one of the long tables and sat down next to a guy I'd seen around but never formally met. He was maybe mid-30s, with a perpetual squirrel and was already mid conversation with two other workers across from us. I nodded hello and started unwrapping my sandwich while they continued talking about last night's game. The conversation was normal enough until the guy next to me, whose name tag read Dennis, suddenly shifted topics and started complaining about management. Dennis launched into a rant about how the owner never showed his face on the floor and probably sat in his office counting money all day while deal workers busted their backs. The two guys across from us nodded along, clearly having heard this speech before. I kept my expression neutral and took a bite of my sandwich, listening carefully as Janice described in detail how he imagined I spent my days. According to him, I rolled into work around noon in a luxury car, took 3 hour lunches at expensive restaurants, and I left by 40 without ever setting foot in the actual plant. He said the owner clearly did not care about the people who made him rich and probably could not even operate the machinery if his life depended on it. One of the other guys mentioned he would hear the owner has some rich kid who inherited the businesses, which was not true at all since I would bought it with money I would saved from the working two jobs for decades. But I did not correct him, just kept eating and listening while Dennis get more animated with each complaint. He was really warming up now, gesturing with his sandwich and raising his buzz enough that people at nearby tables were starting to glance over. Dennis went on to say that the owner probably did not even know half the workers' names and definitely did not appreciate how hard everyone worked to keep production numbers up. He complained probably didn't even know half of the workers, definitely did not appreciate how they brave everyone worked to keep production numbers up. He complained about the lack of raises this year, which stung because we'd actually given modest increases to 70% of the staff based on performance reviews. And not everyone got raises because not everyone deserved them. But apparently Dennis felt entitled to more money regardless of his contribution. He started listening all the ways he thought the owner was incompetent, including the recent decision to upgrade our quality control system, which Dennis called a waste of money that could have gone to worker bonuses. I happen to know that quality control upgrade had already caught three major defects that would have cost us a huge client contract. But Dennis clearly did not have that information. His buddy across the table asked if Dennis had ever actually seen the owner. And Dennis snorted and said he would not recognize him if he walked right past him in the hallway. The irony was not lost on me as I sat there 6 in from his elbow, drinking my water and letting him continue. The lent continued for another 10 minutes as Dennis described how he had been working at the plant for 8 months and had never once received recognition for his contributions. He said he worked harder than anyone else on his line, and that the owner probably did not even know his name or care. What is excellent attendance record? I made a mental note to check Dennis' file later because I had a feeling his version of events might not match reality. One of the other workers tried to change the subject, but Dennis was on a roll now, complaining about the break room coffee being cheap and the parking not needing repaving and a dozen other issues. Both guilt and pity. Some of his complaints were actually fair points that I would already been working on with my operations manager, but others were just whining about normal workplace inconveniences that every company deal with. Dennis declared that if he ever met the owner face to face, he would tell him exactly what he thought about how the place was being run, and that someone needed to give the boss a reality check about what actually happened on the floor. The two guys across from us were starting to look uncomfortable now, probably sensing that Dennis was going too far, but he did not pick up on their body language at all. I finished my sandwich and ordered up the paper bag, still not saying anything. But Dennis pivoted then to complaining about the company's safety protocols. He called them overkill and said the owner was probably just worried about lawsuits rather than actually caring about worker safety. This one particularly annoyed me because we would implemented those protocols after a serious accident at a computer's plant had injured 3 people, and I would spend weeks working with safety consultants to make sure our people were protected. Dennis' dismissive attitude toward those measures told me a lot about his judgment and priorities. He went on to say that the owner had probably never worked a real day in his life and would not last 2 hours doing actual manual labor. I had actually started in this industry running machines on a factory floor and had worked my way up over 15 years. But again, I did not credit his assumptions. One of the other workers glanced at his watch and said he needed to get back to his station, clearly looking for an escape from Dennis' monologue. Dennis barely noticed as the guy left, immediately turning his attention to complaining about the company's death. Insurance plan. The health insurance company was particularly rich because we offered one of the better plans in the area after I would specifically negotiated with providers to get comprehensive coverage for our employees. Dennis claimed that deductibles were too high and the owner probably had some premium plan while everyone else got screwed with their minimum coverage. In reality, I had the exact same plan as everyone else because I believe in leading by example. But Dennis had constructed this narrative about evil management that did not match reality at all. He said he'd heard the owner lived in some mansion on the lake and drove multiple luxury cars, showing how out of touch he was with regular people, and actually lived in a modest three-bedroom house in a middle-aged nearby hood and drove a truck that was 7 years old. But I was curious how far Dennis would go with his fictional versions of my life. The remaining worker across from us was now actively avoiding eye contact and eating his lunch every quickly. Clearly want to be anywhere else. Dennis did not notice or did not care, launching into a story about how his friend at another company had an owner who actually cared about employees and treated them with respect. I checked my watch and realized Dennis had been complaining for over 30 minutes straight without barely pausing for breath. The guy had stamina. I would give him that. He circled back to his original complaint about the owner never being visible on the floor. Saying it showed a complete lack of leadership and engagement, he declared that a real leader would be down her every day talking to workers and understanding their concerns instead of hiding in an ivory tower. The thing was, I actually did come down to the floor regularly, just not in a way that announced my patience with fanfare. I believe you'd learn more by observing quietly than by having everyone put on a show because the boss was watching. But Dennis had apparently never noticed me doing any of my previous visits, which said something about his awareness of his surroundings. We moved on to complaining about the production quads, calling them unrealistic and proved that management did not understand how the work actually got done. I knew for a fact those quarters are based on careful time studies and were constantly made by most of the workforce, which suggested the problem might be Dennis' efficiency rather than the standards themselves. The last worker at our table finally gave up on his lunch and exhausted himself, leaving just me and Dennis sitting there. Dennis barely acknowledged him leaving, too caught up in his complaints to notice he had lost his audience except for me. He started talking about how the owner probably got his job through connections rather than merit, and how that's what was wrong with business in general. He said people like that never understood what it meant to actually work for a living and just coasted on privilege and family money. Every assumption he made was wrong, but I let him continue, fascinated by how someone could be so confident while being so completely misinformed. Dennis said he had been thinking about looking for another job because he did not want to work for someone who did not value his contributions. He asked me if I ever thought about leaving. I shook my head and said I was pretty happy with my situation here. Les looked at me like I was crazy and said he did not understand how anyone could be satisfied working for such a discontented and incompetent owner. I almost laughed but managed to keep my expression neutral. Dennis glanced at his watch and swore, saying his break ended 5 minutes ago and his supervisor was probably going to write him up for being late again. The word again suggested this was a pattern, which explained some things about his employment record. He stood up and gave his start, still muttering about management and how unfair everything was. I asked him casually what department he worked in, and he said he was in assembly on the blind. Then asked why I wanted to know. I shrugged and said I was just curious since I was relatively new and tried to learn everyone's name and rules. Dennis nodded and said good luck with that since there were over 200 people in the plant and management. Not care enough to know any of them anyway. He walked off toward and the production floor, leaving his complaints hanging in the air like a bad smell. I sat there for another minute, finishing my water and thinking about everything I would just heard. Some of his complaints were valid concerns I should address, but most of it was just uninformed gripping from someone who would rather blame others than look at his own performance. I gathered my trash and headed toward the administrative wing, nodding to workers I passed in the hallway. Several of them greeted me my name, which contradicted Dennis' claim that I was invisible and unknowable. I made my way to my office and found my operation manager Claudia waiting the weekly operation reports. She asked how my lunch office alarm but did not ask questions, just noted and left to get the information. While I waited, I pulled up our HR system and looked at Dennis' record myself. He would been hired 8 months ago, like he said, and his attendance was actually dozen with only 2 absences. Two of Dennis' minor complaints that were easy wins. I also worked with Russell to identify high performers who deserved recognition, and we implemented a quarterly awards program with small bonuses for top achievers. None of these changes were earth-shattering, but they showed that I was listening and responsive to legitimate concerns. Several workers mentioned that they would hear about what happened with Dennis, and while the details were probably garbled through the rumor mill, the general message had gotten through that taking trash about the owner to a stranger might backfire spectacularly. I never saw Dennis again after that day, but I heard through the grapevine that he would find another job at a smaller manufacturing plant across town. I hope he would learn something from our encounter and would approach his new position with a better attitude. The whole experience had taught me some valuable lessons too, about the importance of clear communication and the danger of letting employees construct false narratives about leadership. I realized that my preference for quiet observation had some benefits, but also created information gaps that people filled with assumption and speculation. Finding that right balance between being accessible and being overbearing was tricky, but I was committed to improving. I also learned that sometimes that harshest critics have the weakest performance records and that people who spend all their time complaining often to do so to avoid looking at their own shortcomings. Niels had been so convinced of his own excellence and my question whether his perceptions matched reality. 6 months later, I was back in that same back room having lunch and happened to sit with some of the workers from the building. The team Dennis had been on. They were chatting about normal stuff when one of them mentioned they would gotten a new team member who was working out much better than the last guy they would had. And the worker laughed and said, yeah, at least this one does not spend half his break complaining about everything. They did not mention Dennis by name, but I knew who they meant. I asked how the new person was working out, and they said great, really positive attitude and solid production numbers. It was a reminder that sometimes addition by subtraction is the best move of a team, and that removing one negative voice and can improve morale of everyone else. I finished my lunch and headed back to tip Passing through the production floor where machines hummed and workers focused on their tasks. The place was not perfect and never would be, but it was running well and most people seemed reasonably content with their jobs. That was all I would realistically hope for as an owner. The Dennis incident became something of a legend as the plant. One of those stories that got told into new hearts as a cautionary tales about assumption and professionalism. I have various versions of it over the following years, some accurate and some wildly embellished. In one version, I would supposedly fire Dennis on the spot in breakdown in front of everyone, which was not remotely true, but he made for a more dramatic story. I did not bother correcting the exaggerations because the core message was sound regardless of the specific details. Be careful what you say about people you don't know because you never know who might be listening. Focus on your own performance before criticizing others. Treat everyone with basic respect even if you think they are beneath your notice. These were not completed lessons, but apparently they were needed to learn through experience for some people. Dennis had probably that experience in a spectacular fashion, and while I doubted he would thank me for it, I hoped he would ground from it nonetheless. As for me, I continued my quiet observation and regular check-ins, always learning and always trying to improve both our business and myself as a leader. Thanks for hanging out till the end. If you want more stories, make sure to subscribe and leave our take below.